The year is 1744, and you are already dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, not the way deaths happen in stories, with last words and gathered family and a moment of peaceful acceptance. You are dying the way most people died in colonial America, slowly, incrementally, degree by degree, as the cold takes from you everything it can reach. You wake before dawn. You always wake before dawn in winter, not because you want to, not because there's anything to wake for in this darkness, but because the fire has gone low again, and the cold has found its way through the gaps in the timber walls and settled onto your skin like a second blanket, heavier than wool and far less forgiving. The cabin around you is 16 feet wide and 20 feet long. That is the entire world you inhabit from November through April. You, your wife, your 3 children, and whatever livestock you brought inside to keep them from freezing in the barn. The smell is exactly what you would imagine. You wake before dawn, not because you are rested, but because the cold has found the thin places in your clothing and worked its way in. It gnaws at your fingers first, then your wrists, then your elbows, until even the smallest movement feels expensive. There is no clean silence. The air inside the rough fort is thick with smoke that never fully leaves. It clings to your hair, your blanket, your skin. Somewhere nearby, a weak cough repeats itself, small, wet, and patient, like an animal scratching at a door. You taste the river on your tongue even before you drink. Salt at high tide, slime at low, filth stirred up from the bottom. The kind of water that makes your stomach tighten before it even touches your lips. Men used to stronger lives, men who once crossed an ocean, now lie on the ground as if the earth itself is pulling them down. Outside the wooden palisade, you do not roam, you do not hunt, you do not gather, you do not stray far enough to see the trees clearly, because beyond those sharpened stakes, watchers move through the winter woods, and they understand something you are only beginning to learn. They do not have to storm your walls to kill you. They can simply wait. And as your food disappears, as the fort grows quieter, as the living begin to look like the dead, you start to wonder something that feels both humiliating and true. If you were here, right now, in the winter of 1609, would you survive even a single week? If you're settling in for sleep, get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Tonight, you're stepping into one of the bleakest seasons in early American history, the winter that Jamestown colonists would later call the starving time, when hunger, sickness, and a siege tightened around them until most of the settlement simply vanished. If you enjoy slow, dark, immersive history, told gently enough to rest to, consider liking the video. It helps more than you'd think. And if you want more long-form, boring history for sleep, subscribing is the easiest way to find your way back here. You don't have to stay awake for every detail. You can let the names and dates drift by like embers in a dying hearth. But if you do stay with the story, you'll move through the fort's smoke-stained lanes, feel the strange taste of brackish river water, and watch how quickly a human community can unravel when food becomes a rumor. By the end, you'll understand why this winter wasn't just hard. It was designed to break them. Now, by dawn, you are already hungry. You are in Virginia, on the James River, at a settlement called Jamestown, founded in 1607 by English colonists who arrived expecting opportunity and found something far more punishing. From the beginning, the place offers contradictions. Natural abundance on the shoreline, yet sickness and hunger inside the fort. Wide water that promises travel, yet water that can be salty and foul. A landscape filled with life, yet a human community always close to collapse. In the early years, survival is never guaranteed. Summer brings illness so routinely that colonists come to recognize a pattern. Heat, insects, contaminated water, malnutrition, and the weakening of bodies that have crossed an ocean only to meet a new kind of suffering. In one early wave, more than half die. Reinforcements arrive, then sickness takes another share, then more reinforcements arrive again, like trying to fill a crocked bucket while it leaks. And behind all of it, like a slow turning screw, is the environment itself. Tree ring studies, evidence taken from the growth patterns of trees, show that the colonists arrived at the start of a 7-year drought, 606 to 612, described as the driest period in centuries for that region. That drought does not only harm the English, it squeezes the food supply for the indigenous peoples of the area as well. It reduces the margin of generosity, the capacity to trade,
the ability to accept strangers who arrive hungry and demanding. The indigenous world.
Jamestown is not a scattered emptiness. It is Senekomoko, a paramount chiefdom of many communities, led by a paramount chief the English call Powhatan. This is a political landscape with alliances, obligations, and power, one that the English do not fully understand and often refuse to respect. You live inside a wooden fort, tight, crowded, and often sour with smoke. The fort is not a neat village. It is a cramped defensive space where privacy is minimal and the smell of bodies and waste can linger. Every small problem grows sharper when it is shared by hundreds of people in a confined space. For food, the English rely heavily on what they can ship from overseas, what they can grow, and crucially, what they can obtain from nearby communities through trade, negotiation, or force. But in drought years, trade is not an endless well, and the English are not at first consistently skilled at hunting, fishing, or farming to sustain themselves in this new environment. Instead, they often behave like a garrison waiting for supply, expecting the world to feed them because they have arrived. Leadership is another fault line. Captain John Smith becomes a central figure early on, pushing harsh discipline and the idea that work equals survival, famously insisting that those who will not work should not eat. Under his tenure, the colony manages to get through one difficult winter with comparatively fewer deaths, though conflict and tension remain. But the political situation shifts dramatically in 1609. The Virginia Company changes the colony's governing structure under a new charter, and new leadership is intended to take over. A major resupply effort, an armada of 9 ships carrying hundreds of people and supplies, sets out to rescue and expand the colony. Then the Atlantic intervenes. A hurricane scatters the fleet. The flagship, the Sea Venture, is separated and wrecked in Bermuda, taking with it key leaders and supplies. Other ships arrive, but not in the condition the colony needs, and the sudden arrival of many hungry new mouths without the full intended provision turns Jamestown into a pressure cooker. By late summer and fall, relations with surrounding communities deteriorate into open violence. English parties sent out to live off the land or obtain food suffered deadly attacks. George Percy describes grim scenes, corpses found, and the message left by the attackers, mouths stuffed with bread in contempt. It is a kind of communication, and it is not subtle. Then John Smith leaves Virginia, wounded by a gunpowder explosion and forced back to England. A leadership vacuum forms. George Percy becomes president of the council in Virginia, and as autumn thins into winter, Powhatan's forces choose a strategy that does not require a grand assault. They lay siege. From roughly November 1609 to May 1610, the fort is pressured and contained. The English are prevented from safely leaving to hunt, fish, bargain, or steal food. Powhatan's people use the landscape as a weapon and time as an ally. The English are trapped with dwindling supplies, contaminated water, and the slow failure of the human body when hunger becomes constant. This is the doorway into the winter. And now you step through it. By dawn, the fort is already awake, not with energy, but with need. You sit up from wherever you slept, perhaps on straw, perhaps on a rough pallet, perhaps on boards that never fully dry. Everything feels damp. Even when the air is cold, the settlement holds moisture in its wood, its earth, its clothing. Smoke from indoor fires stains beams and hangs in the air, because a fort built for defense is not built for comfort. You would expect winter to bring clarity, cold air, clean breath, crisp mornings. Instead, you get a suffocating mix, smoke and human closeness, the stench of waste that cannot be easily removed, and the lingering odor of sickness, sweat turned sour, breath turned metallic, vomit and diarrhea in corners people avoid until they can't. These details do not survive in neat paintings, but they survive in the logic of what happens when bodies weaken in confinement. The fort's shape is simple: timber walls, sharpened stakes, defensive points. But what it really is during siege is a container for human decline. The less you can move, the more each problem concentrates. A minor illness becomes an outbreak, a small shortage becomes panic, a single dirty water source becomes a slow poison. And water in this winter is not a neutral thing. George Percy describes drinking cold water taken from the river, sometimes very salt at high tide and full of slime and filth at low tide, calling it destruction of many of our men.
You can taste it just imagining it, a brackish bitterness, a faint mouth, a gritty texture that makes you swallow hard. Unlike today, where clean water is expected, invisible, taken for granted, you would have to decide every day whether thirst is worse than the sickness that follows the drink.
Thirst always wins in the end. The cold does not just chill you, it changes behavior. When the fort is under siege, leaving to gather firewood becomes dangerous. But without wood, you cannot cook what little you have. You cannot boil water. You cannot warm the sick. So you burn what you can. You ration heat the way you ration food, by trying not to move too much, by huddling, by letting the fire go low, and telling yourself it is better than nothing. There is another cruelty in winter, the way it makes time feel longer. In summer, hunger can be briefly distracted by activity, by light, by movement. In winter, darkness arrives early. The day narrows. You have long hours to feel your body and count your supplies. And if you are sick, you do it lying still, listening to the fort's sounds, the crackle of weak fires, the muffled steps of those who still have strength, the occasional distant noise beyond the walls that reminds you you are watched. Outside the palisade, the world continues. Somewhere beyond, the people besieging you are not trapped in a timber box. They can move through woods, choose their ground, decide whether to engage. They can deny you access to hunting and fishing simply by making the price of leaving too high. And the English quickly learn that stepping beyond the fort's protection can mean death. So you stay inside. You watch the river through gaps in the walls. You watch the tree line. You watch your companions change shape, cheeks hollowing, eyes dulling, shoulders sharpening. Percy later writes that many looked like anatomies, skeleton-like forms, crying out that they were starved. The word is old, but the image is clear: human beings reduced to structure. And even when you try to sleep, your body will not fully let you. Because hunger is not merely an empty stomach. It is a persistent sensation that crawls outward, into your thoughts, into your temper, into the way you see other people. It makes the fort feel smaller, the air thicker, the future shorter. Percy calls it the sharp prick of hunger, and it reads like a needle pressed into the mind. Forget what you know about roughing it. This is not camping, not adventure, not pioneer romance. This is a siege in a drought-strained world, inside a fort where the water itself can harm you, where fuel is limited, where darkness stretches, and where each day begins with the same quiet question: what part of you will fail next? Throughout the day, the fort's most important activity is not building, it is calculating. How much remains, how long it will last, who deserves it, who will take it anyway. George Percy describes the ration as a small can of barley boiled in water for 5 men per day, a portion so thin it feels like an insult, and yet it is life. You can picture the pot, cloudy water, a few swollen grains, the smell of smoke clinging to it, the heat gone quickly once it is ladled out. Unlike today, where a meal is often measured by pleasure, you would measure it by function. Can you stand afterward? Can you think? Can you keep your hands from shaking? In Jamestown's starving time, food becomes a staircase downward. Percy's account is relentless. First horses and other beasts, then dogs, cats, rats, mice, anything that can be caught, killed, chewed. And when even that runs out, leather, boots, shoes, any scrap that can be softened, swallowed, and endured. It is not a metaphor. It is not exaggeration as an idea. Archaeological evidence at Jamestown supports the broad shape of the story, remains consistent with desperate consumption, animals you would not call food in ordinary times, and heavy butchering of horses. A William and Mary account of midden analysis describes evidence of colonists eating domestic animals, horses and dogs, during that winter, while fear of attack kept them from leaving the fort to find better options. Now imagine the reality of eating like that. Horse meat, butchered without ceremony, boiled down until it is tough and stringy, and the fat has a smell that turns your stomach even as your body begs for it. Dogs, animals that once might have been companions or tools, now reduced to bones and scraps. Rats and mice, small and frantic, caught in corners and consumed with hands that tremble. And then leather,
Unlike meat, leather does not truly feed you. It is material made to endure weather and time. You might soften it by boiling. You might scrape it. You might chew until your jaw aches. But what you swallow is stubborn. Your gut struggles. Your body wastes anyway. Yet hunger pushes people into acts that feel afterward like waking from a nightmare and realizing it was real. This is where myth-busting belongs. The myth says early America was overflowing. Game in the woods, fish in the river, abundance everywhere. The truth is that abundance means little when you cannot safely access it, when drought has reduced overall supply, and when a siege turns the landscape into a killing zone. Powhatan's forces do not need
to empty the woods of animals. They only need to make your attempt to reach them lethal. And the English make it worse. Their earlier aggression, their raids, their burning of crops, their violent encounters, these actions do not vanish when winter arrives. They become part of the reason the fort is surrounded, watched, denied. In this sense, famine is not only weather, it is politics, it is consequence. Hunger changes social rules. It changes the way people speak. You begin to notice that conversations shrink toward one topic: food. Who has it? Who might have hidden it? Who is getting more? Who is too weak to work but still takes a portion? Who looks a little less thin than the rest? And when the communal store becomes a target, when individuals steal to survive, authority responds with violence. Percy writes that some robbed the store and were executed. In a starving fort, justice is not gentle. It is designed to terrify. As the sun sets, the fort's hunger does not sleep. It lies down with you, a weight in the belly, a pressure behind the eyes. And in the dead of night, you begin to understand the most frightening part. Hunger is not just suffering. It is a force that teaches you, slowly, what you are willing to become. By dawn, somebody is always trying to impose order, not because order feels noble, but because without it, the fort becomes something worse than starving. It becomes uncontrolled. Jamestown is not only fighting famine, it is fighting internal fracture, leadership disputes, resentment, despair, and the corrosive question of whether anyone is truly in charge. Later observers would blame misgovernment, idleness, and faction, arguing that communal labor and communal food made some men eager to slip away from work while still expecting to be fed. But unlike today, where laziness is treated as a moral flaw, the reality inside a starving fort is different. Malnutrition can cause apathy, weakness, and psychological collapse. What looks like idleness may be the body shutting down. Historians have noted that severe malnutrition produces symptoms that appear psychological: loss of appetite, indifference, when the truth is physical deterioration. Yet the leadership still has to choose an explanation. And idleness is a convenient one because it allows punishment, it allows control. It implies that suffering is deserved. So inside the fort, work becomes coercion. People are assigned tasks: repairing boats, gathering what little can be gathered, making pitch and tar, attempting to keep the settlement functioning. Even as starvation peaks, Percy's account describes people being set to work fitting pinnaces, small ships, when the decision is made to abandon the colony. The body is used until it breaks because there is no alternative. And punishment during famine becomes theatrical. If someone steals from the store, the fear is not only that the food is gone, it is that the social contract is gone. So executions happen. Percy is blunt: theft from the store leads to death. In a modern world, you might imagine trial, appeal, mercy. In Jamestown's winter, mercy is a luxury that can look like weakness. There is also the violence of suspicion. When people begin to disappear, when some run away to the surrounding communities and are never heard from again, every absence feels like betrayal. Percy notes that many ran away unto the salvages, and the phrase itself carries contempt and fear. Those who remain feel abandoned, and they also fear what the runaways might tell, what alliances might form, what retaliation might return. And then there is the simplest brutality of all. You cannot enforce discipline on starving bodies forever. As hunger deepens, the fort's routines degrade. People stop washing, stop mending, stop speaking. They conserve energy by becoming still, and stillness looks like surrender. In this context, one later report gives a startling detail, a claim that some colonists ate fish raw rather than walk a short distance to fetch wood to cook it, presented as evidence of idleness. But in a starving winter, this detail can be read another way. The effort of gathering wood, the danger of leaving cover, the weakness in limbs, every small task becomes immense.
This is how a society fails. Not with one dramatic explosion, but with 1,000 small decisions made by exhausted people, each decision logical in isolation and disastrous in accumulation. And if you were here, you would feel that failure in your own body. Because in the end, order is only as strong as the bodies enforcing it, and the bodies are disappearing. Throughout the day, sickness moves like weather. It settles over the fort, it thickens, it becomes normal. George Percy lists familiar horrors: bloody flux, likely severe diarrhea, burning fevers, swellings, wounds from violence. But he emphasizes famine as the core. Hunger does not always kill directly, it opens the door, and everything else walks in. Unlike today, where disease is often
Confronted with clean water, isolation, medicine, and staff, Jamestown has none of that reliably. You have dirty water, crowding, malnutrition, smoke-filled air, stress that never turns off. In such conditions, even a minor infection becomes fatal. A cut becomes festering, a cough becomes pneumonia, diarrhea becomes dehydration, fever becomes delirium, and because the fort is under siege, even gathering herbs or seeking better water is dangerous. A William and Mary account notes that fear of attack kept colonists inside, and even kept them from seeking better water supplies, meaning the very act of staying alive also prolonged exposure to what was harming them. Then there is the mental damage. Percy describes people going to bed seemingly healthy and being found dead by morning. That detail lands because it suggests the thinness of the line. A body can look stable, then simply stop. And when people face this kind of relentless suffering, they search for meaning. One story from Percy's account becomes a window into the fort's psychology. A man named Hugh Price, driven by extreme hunger, openly blasphemes in the marketplace, crying that there is no God, because if there were, God would not allow such misery. The same day, Price and a butcher go into the woods seeking relief and are killed. Price's body is later found torn by wolves or wild beasts, while the corpulent butcher lies nearby, untouched except for the fatal arrows. Percy reads it as judgment. In the fort, people need a story that explains pain. But you, lying awake in the dark, might read it differently. You might see it as randomness layered on top of suffering. You might feel the terrifying truth that hunger does not negotiate. It does not offer fairness. It does not care who deserves what. And then the fort becomes a place where faith and despair trade places depending on the hour. Some whisper prayers, some curse, some stare silently at the ground, conserving energy even in their thoughts. Some begin to talk about leaving, running away, slipping out, taking the chance. Percy notes that many ran away and were never heard of again. The uncertainty of their fate becomes another kind of haunting. If you were here, you would also face a quieter sickness. The way hunger narrows your world. Your imagination stops reaching months ahead. It barely reaches a day. It becomes harder to remember what being full felt like, harder to picture spring, harder to believe in rescue. And when rescue finally comes, it will not look like triumph. It will look like shock, because it will arrive to find you transformed, thin, smoke-stained, half alive, standing among the shadows of people who are no longer there. By dawn, you understand the siege in your bones, not because you see battles every day, but because you see absence. The absence of safe movement, the absence of trade, the absence of food coming in. Powhatan's strategy is described plainly in modern historical summaries. The Powhatans did not need to risk casualties in direct assault. They used famine as a weapon, preventing settlers from leaving to hunt, fish, bargain, or steal. Time did the killing. Unlike today, where a siege is often imagined as cannons and explosions, this siege is quieter. It is watchers in the woods. It is the knowledge that a man who steps out for roots might not return. Percy writes of people forced to search the woods for serpents and snakes and unknown roots, and many are cut off and slain. The detail matters. Hunger pushes the desperate outward, and the siege turns desperation into a predictable vulnerability. This is also not random conflict. The First Anglo-Powhatan War ignites around food and power. English parties burn towns and crops. Powhatan's people retaliate. Ambushes and torture occur. One key event in late 1609, an English group led by John Ratcliffe is lured on the promise of corn and then ambushed. Ratcliffe is tortured to death. The message is unmistakable. Food will not be taken with cost.
Inside the fort, you hear stories of what happened outside. Sometimes you hear the screams carried by wind. Sometimes you see men return wounded. Sometimes you don't see them return at all. And over time, the fort becomes an island, not surrounded by water, but surrounded by threat. Even the colony's animals become targets. The Powhatan slaughter hogs panned on an island down the James, an attempt by the colonists to be more sanitary, undone by enemies who understand the colony's fragile dependence. The loss is practical and symbolic. You cannot even protect your future meat. There is also a bitter irony, one Percy himself highlights. When the Powhatans lift the siege temporarily in early May 1610 to begin spring planting, Percy goes to Fort Algernon and finds the outpost in good case, with plenty so absurd that hogs are fed leftover crab meat. Percy is furious that this abundance was concealed while Jamestown starved, writing that what was fit for hogs there
have saved many lives at Jamestown. It is a reminder that collapse is not always total. Sometimes it is uneven, hidden, political. If you were in the main fort, you would feel the insult of that revelation like a fresh wound. Because the worst part of famine is not only hunger, it is the suspicion that hunger is avoidable and that someone chose otherwise. And as the sun sets, as winter's end approaches, the fort does not become hopeful, it becomes dangerous in a different way. Because when starvation reaches its limit, human beings do not simply die, they change. In the dead of night, the fort's boundaries dissolve. Not the wooden walls, but the invisible walls inside people. George Percy describes acts that seem incredible, including digging up dead corpses from graves to eat them and licking up blood fallen from weak fellows. These are not easy details, but they are part of the historical record of how far hunger can push a trapped population. Then, Percy recounts a story that sits at the center of Jamestown's darkest mythology. A man who murders his wife, removes the child from her womb, throws it into the river, and salts the mother's body for food. Caught mid-meal, confessed under torture, executed. It reads like a nightmare, and yet it appears not only in Percy's later account, but is echoed in later colonial reporting. This is where myth-busting must be careful. Modern historians note motives. John Smith had reason to emphasize misery after his departure to elevate his own leadership. Percy may have had reason to portray events as beyond his control. Political factions had reason to use horror stories to shift power from company to crown. Some scholars urge caution about taking every detail as literal, even while acknowledging the overwhelming evidence of desperation. But then archaeology speaks in its own language. In 2012, Jamestown rediscovery archaeologists found the mutilated skull and leg bone of an English teenage girl in a cellar deposit associated with the starving time. Forensic analysis by Smithsonian anthropologist Douglas Owsley concluded the skull showed chops and cuts consistent with an attempt to open it and remove tissue and brain, evidence interpreted as survival cannibalism. The project describes this as the first forensic evidence of survival cannibalism at an early European colony in North America. The Smithsonian account goes further into the marks: shallow chops to the forehead, deep chops to the back of the head consistent with a hatchet or cleaver, punctures and cuts around the jaw where tissue was removed. The language is clinical, but the implication is intimate. Someone stood over a dead child and tried, awkwardly, tentatively, to turn her body into food. Jamestown rediscovery calls her Jane, not because her name is known, but because giving her a name makes it harder to look away. If you were in the fort, you would not experience this as a neat fact. You would experience it as a slow moral suffocation. At first, you would swear you would never cross certain lines. Then you would become so hungry that lines would begin to look like luxuries. And finally, you would understand the most chilling truth about starvation. It does not only kill bodies, it kills the person you believed you were. And then, after months, rescue arrives, and it is not triumphant. In May 1610, survivors of the Sea Venture wreck in Bermuda finally reach Virginia and come to Jamestown. What they find is catastrophic. About 60 survivors where hundreds once stood. The arriving leaders are horrified by faces that look like famine made them into something not quite human. The decision is made to abandon the colony. Ships are prepared. People want to burn the town. And then, on the river, a final reversal.
The arrival of Lord Delaware with supplies forces Jamestown to continue. The fort will persist, but it will never forget this winter, and neither will the story of America that grows from it. Now, the worst is over, but the memory remains like smoke in wood. It never fully leaves. As the sun sets, long after the siege has lifted, Jamestown's deadliest winter lingers in the mind not because it is dramatic, but because it is human. It is hunger, used as a weapon. It is a fort that traps heat poorly and traps people too well. It is water that tastes like the river's shifting mouth, salt, slime, filth, drunk anyway because thirst is merciless. It is leadership that tries to explain collapse with words like idleness, because admitting the true fragility of the human body is terrifying. It is the quiet, unbearable arithmetic of rationing. And it is the way famine can drive a society to consume what it once loved, what it once protected, what it once would have buried with reverence. Percy's words about vermin, leather, even the dead, are not there to entertain. They are there because someone lived through it and needed to put the memory somewhere. And then there is Jane, an unnamed girl made briefly.
Visible again by archaeology and forensic analysis. Her bones carrying evidence of a desperate act that history long argued about in words alone. Whatever you believe about every rumor and every story, her remains stand as a hard, physical reminder that this winter was not exaggerated in its essence. People were starving. People were trapped. People did what starving, trapped people sometimes do. If you're still awake, let that settle gently. Not as horror, as truth. Because the question is not whether you are brave enough for the past. The question is whether your body, your ordinary modern body, could endure a world where clean water is uncertain, calories are scarce, and safety is a fence that keeps you in. If you found this kind of slow history comforting, consider liking the video before you drift off. And if you want more long, quiet stories from the darker corners of the past, you can subscribe, so when you need sleep again, you'll know where to find it. For now, let the fort fade. Let the river's bitter chase dissolve. Let the winter pass, and let yourself rest.